Welcome to Haghia Sophia, Reflections on History, Faith, and Politics. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today for this event, which has been convened in response to the recent reconversion of the Haghia Sophia into a mosque this July. I'd like to, on behalf of myself and Mohidin Mesbahi, the director of the Mohsen and Fawzia Jaffer Muslim World Studies Center, I'd like to thank the School of International Public Affairs at FIU and the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series for sponsoring this event. And I'd like to thank the three of my co-panelists for participating in what we hope to be a productive discussion in front of this diverse audience. So first I'll introduce my co-panelists. Emily Neumeyer is a historian of art and architecture of the Islamic world at Temple University. She is a specialist in the Eastern Mediterranean, and her current research combines issues of architectural patronage, center-periphery relations, and theories of geography and landscape to investigate the shifting power dynamics of the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 18th century. Jamil Aydin is a historian of the modern Middle East and modern Asia at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He focuses especially on the international and intellectual histories of the Ottoman and Japanese empires. He is the author of The Idea of the Muslim World, A Global Intellectual History, published in 2017, and The Politics of Anti-Westernism in Asia, published in 2007. Muhammad Humayun Vash is the founding director of the Institute for Interfaith Dialogue and Education at Miami-Dade College and a lecturer at the School of International and Public Affairs at FIU and the Religious Studies Department at the University of Miami. He is the author of Iran and the Nuclear Question, published by Routledge in 2017. And I am Carlos Grenier. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Florida International University. I focus especially on the intellectual history of the Ottoman Empire, of the early Ottoman Empire especially. So what prompts this panel, as I said, is a contemporary event, the reconversion by the government of Turkey of Haghia Sophia in Istanbul from a museum space into a mosque, which held its first collective Friday prayers in 85 years on July 26, 2020. Since my training is that of an Ottoman historian of the pre-modern period, what I'll do here is give a brief historical overview of the Haghia Sophia. Most of you in attendance know that few structures have in the history of the world accumulated such a wealth of different meanings, such a density of symbolic associations over time. The main point I'd like to make in the remarks that follow is that the symbols and meanings held by Haghia Sophia are shared ones. At no point did the structure radically change its architectural character or lose its role as a site of reverence. The stories Muslims and Christians tell about it are interwoven. It has always been characterized more by continuity than by revolution. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian, when he built the structure in 532 CE, envisioned a church that would bring to a central focus a city that had recently been ravaged by civil unrest. He renamed it Haghia Sophia, Church of the Holy Wisdom. To build it, materials were quarried from the extent of the Eastern Roman Empire. Marbles were taken from the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek in what is now Lebanon, and from Thebes in Upper Egypt. Its dome, compared to the vault of heaven by writers who saw its construction, was for almost a millennium the largest dome in the world. The church provided the Byzantine state with a center of festival and ritual. It was where the emperors were crowned. It housed relics, the bench upon which Christ sat, wood from Noah's Ark, the trumpet of Joshua. Even the true cross was housed there briefly, in 628, at the height of the Byzantine-Persian Wars. It was the heart of one of late antiquity's two great empires, the Byzantine and the Persian, which a historian writing at the time had called the two eyes of the earth. Around this time, in Mecca and Medina, far outside of these empires, Muhammad was receiving the revelation of the Quran. In the Surat al-Rum, the Quran's 30th chapter, some interpreted an allusion to a distant day when Constantinople would fall into the hands of Muslim believers. Indeed, the fate of the early Islamic Caliphate was bound up with the fate of the Byzantines, and this apocalyptic expectation was certainly a motivation of attempts by Arab armies to conquer Constantinople. The most famous of these was led by the commander Maslama, who unsuccessfully besieged the city in 717. Memories of this failed expedition, intertwined with the predictions of the Surat al-Rum, found their way into medieval writings on the apocalypse, both Muslim and Christian, that describe Haghia Sophia as a focal point for the events of the end times. According to the most common of the Christian apocalyptic narratives, the church will first be taken by unbelievers, but will finally become the sanctuary of the last Roman emperor who will usher in the end of days. According to another Christian text, the church will survive the apocalyptic flood and float above the waters. Muslim apocalyptic writings mirrored these same images. They predicted that the great church would be conquered by a Muslim leader, who would then be driven out again, and finally it would be reconquered by the Messiah at the end of times. In other words, the Church of Haghia Sophia was embedded in the sacred history of both Muslims and Christians. It was a site where, for both, the end of times would happen. By the 14th century, the Turkish principalities of Anatolia shared an awareness of nearby Constantinople and the building that was at its heart. The Surat al-Rum was commonly recited and interpreted in mosques across Anatolia. Some were moved to travel to visit the church. The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta toured the city and marveled at the size of the church and its golden doors, but refrained from going in, not willing to enter a Christian space where, as he claims, his own worship was forbidden. I won't repeat the story of the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the conquest of Constantinople by Sultan Mehmed II in 1453, a narrative that is now so firmly entrenched in Turkish historical memory. Instead, I'll give voice to a few legends repeated among the Turkish-speaking population that had by then surrounded the hinterlands of the city. Though some legends depict this church as a curse laid upon the Ottomans by its mysterious ancient past, most legends from around the time of the conquest depicted the church in a very positive light. According to one of these stories, the day when Muhammad was born, the dome of Haghia Sophia collapsed and could not be repaired. The prophet in distant Arabia heard of this years later and gathered a handful of clay, instructing a messenger to travel to Haghia Sophia and add this clay to the bricks. The dome was then able to stand again. He said he did this because he knew that Muslims would eventually worship there. We read of another legend from the 15th century, that when the building was constructed, a certain holy dervish was asked by a workman to watch his tools while he went to find some lunch. The workman never returned, but the dervish, true to his oath, still remains there, having transformed into an invisible angel, living out its days in the sanctuary. In an uncanny echo of this story, a Greek folktale describes how when the Ottoman army burst into the church, a liturgy was interrupted, and the priest was then spirited away behind a magical barrier, hiding in secret in the church to this day. It was this web of shared Christian and Muslim prophecy and legend that the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II encountered when he took control of the church in 1453. Both Turkish and Greek accounts discuss how he was curious about the building, climbing up to inspect its dome, meditating on its grandeur. When he later built his own mosque in another part of the city, he modeled it explicitly on Haghia Sophia. The structure went on to define the contours of Ottoman religious architecture. And in the upper right here, you can see the mosque of Mehmed II. When Mehmed II repurposed the building as a mosque, he used as his legal justification a now famous ruling that this repurposing was lawful under Islamic law on account of its having been taken by force rather than peaceful surrender. Despite this legal right, he did not radically change anything about the structure. Even its Greek name was kept, being ascribed the meaning of space of worship. Not only was the old name kept, but a mosaic of Christ remained visible on the dome, along with other figures. The Christian origins of the structure did not trouble most Ottomans, who seemed to have recognized that the building, when it was a church, also served the worship of God. And, just as in Byzantine times, Haghia Sophia was the paramount religious structure of the city, the so-called commander of the mosques. In the hierarchy of Ottoman religious officials, the Imam of Haghia Sophia was the highest ranking. As the nearest mosque to the imperial palace, it was often the site of the Sultan's own prayers. Foreshadowing images more recently resurrected by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, an Ottoman observer compared the mosque to the Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem and to the Kaaba in Mecca, saying that prayers there were almost as sacred as prayers offered at those two sites. In the early 17th century, most of the figural mosaics in the main prayer space were finally painted over. Yet even at this point, the mosaic of the Virgin in the apse behind the mihrab was apparently left intact. As Haghia Sophia grew more and more central to the mythology of the Ottoman state, its memory was cleared of Byzantine and Christian associations. In the 19th century, a legend emerged echoing the much earlier Byzantine practice of crowning the emperors in the church. It was said that the last Mamluk ruler of Egypt bestowed the mantle of the prophet upon Sultan Selim I in the mosque, endowing him the right to be caliph. This reflects the growing prominence of Ottoman claims to the caliphate in the 19th century. Also at this time, the remaining mosaics were whitewashed and the interior space more thoroughly Islamicized. Haghia Sophia, which had long served as a symbol of imperial continuity, was being reforged as a symbol of Muslim identity. By the beginning of the 20th century, the structure had found a new symbolic role as the focus of both Greek irredentist claims to Constantinople and as a symbol of Ottoman authority in the Sunni Muslim world. As a way to reject both of these meanings, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the leader of the Turkish Republic, transformed the mosque to a museum in 1934, and for 85 years it functioned as an emblem of the ideology of the secular Turkish Republic. Today, the state has returned to Mehmed II's original justification for the conversion of the building and decreed that Haghia Sophia may return to its original essence of a mosque. In July, this came to pass. It is hard to see an original essence in a structure as storied as Haghia Sophia because it can never do away with the meanings it has accumulated throughout its past. There are parts of it that cannot be erased by state decrees or by layers of paint. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the apocalyptic legends that had circulated among Muslims and Christians since the 8th and 9th century remain circulating. Many Muslims also feel that prayers there are especially powerful. Its memory as the heart of Orthodox Christianity also lingers. Even the various legends and myths told about the Haghia Sophia can still be sensed, even if faintly, in the charged atmosphere that makes the building feel so sacred to even the most casual of tourists. All of these traces of past meanings remain and continue as vocabularies with which to interpret it. The commander of the mosques and the mother of churches will continue to accumulate a dense and shared web of meanings and continue to act in its own way as a protagonist at history's center. Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce the other panelists. We're going to begin with Emily Neumeyer and continue with Jamil Aydin and Mohammad Humayun Vash. Thank you.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Grenier and the Jaffer Center for extending this invitation to join this roundtable. So I'm a historian of art and architecture, and it is in this capacity in the next few minutes, I'd like to touch on some concerns raised by the current situation in terms of preservation and cultural heritage. And cultural heritage management, and why it's important to know something about the longer history of the building when engaged in present debates. First, let me say a few words about my own research and how I came to this topic. I'm a historian of Islamic art and architecture with a focus on the architecture of the Ottoman Empire. Back in 2018, I organized a symposium with my Byzantinist colleague Benjamin Anderson about Haghia Sophia in the long 19th century. Surprisingly, what happened to this building in the modern period remains relatively understudied. And I consider the 19th century the modern period, but I know that may not be the case for everyone else on this panel. But in any case, we set about bringing a group of historians together to talk about different ways various actors engaged with the building during this period, from local communities of Greek-speaking Christians living in Istanbul to the Ottoman state officials who launched a major restoration campaign in the mid-19th century. And I will say more about that a little later. All right, so here I am minding my own business, working on this project about Haghia Sophia. We're now working to publish it as a book. And then July 10th happens. Turkish courts declare that the conversion of Haghia Sophia into a museum in the 1930s to be unlawful, and President Erdogan issues a decree that the site will once again become a mosque. And actually, the people who have been following the situation for some time had an inkling that this was going to happen back in November, when the Turkish courts established a precedent for the ruling about Haghia Sophia by handing down a similar decision about another Byzantine church that was then an Ottoman mosque and now a museum, which is called the Kariye, or the Hora Museum. In anticipation of the official ruling in July, my colleague Ben Anderson and I felt like we needed to get organized and build some consensus among Byzantine and Ottoman historians, i.e. the people who are experts on the building itself, about our stance on the current situation. Along with a few other colleagues, we wrote and published on Medium an open letter about the status of Haghia Sophia, available in 4 languages, English, Turkish, Greek, and French, which in the first week was viewed about 15,000 times and collected almost 400 signatures. I know 400 signatures doesn't sound like a lot, but all signatories have PhDs in Byzantine or Ottoman studies, And take my word for it that the fact that we got so many Byzantinists and Ottomanists to come together and agree on something as controversial as Haghia Sophia is nothing short of miraculous. Let me give you some of the highlights of the concerns that we raised specifically about issues of preservation and management of the monument. Most importantly, we pointed out that the debate over the status of the building, should Haghia Sophia be a museum or a mosque, was ultimately a distraction from the more pressing question, which is, how can we best care for Haghia Sophia? In other words, if we do not properly look after the building now and preserve it for future generations, then there's really not much point in arguing about what kinds of activities are taking place inside. Of course, I do not want to dismiss how charged and important this question of status is for the various stakeholders, but I think this even further underlines how important it is to have a solid management strategy in place for the building. Just to be clear, I would say the number one question for art historians about the conversion of the building back into a mosque is what will be done with the Byzantine mosaics. And for those who don't know, a mosaic is a technique where you create an image from very small pieces of different colored stones. And the Byzantines were very well known for this artistic style. Over the centuries, as both a church and a mosque, Haghia Sophia has become a vast repository for spectacular works of art, including this mosaic of the Virgin Mary and Jesus found in the apse, as well as these massive medallions of Islamic calligraphy bearing the names of revered figures within Islam. And the one I'm showing you here is the name of Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. The main issue is that typically mosques do not include any representations of human figures out of concern that they may encourage false devotion and essentially take away from the worship of God. But I also want to stress here that this is not only the case, this is only the case for religious art and architecture. And there are plenty of examples for the depiction of the human figure in Islamic art in secular settings, like the court of the Ottoman Sultan. We have many examples. And I also want to point out that this ambivalence about the representation of human figures in religious settings is not exclusive to Islam. This was a major issue during the Protestant Reformation, for example, and the Byzantines even went through their own period of what was called iconoclasm. The majority of the Byzantine mosaics that can be seen in the building today were uncovered in the 1930s when Haghia Sophia was converted into a museum in the early years of the Turkish Republic. And this means that the mosaics were covered up at some point in the Ottoman period, but the timeline for that is worth looking into, as I will discuss in just a moment. Okay, so having said all that, in terms of conservation, probably of primary concern is that the change in function of status of the building seems to correspond with the change in the administration. While the Haghia Sophia Museum was managed by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, which has a pretty good track record in terms of the preservation of buildings, the conversion of the building back into a mosque transfers control to the Directorate General of Pious Foundations. In recent years, the Directorate General has assumed control of other Byzantine monuments and reopened them to Muslim worship. One prominent example is another Haghia Sophia, this one in Trabzon on the Black Sea, whose proper administration has been contested since 2013. An effort to reopen the building to Muslim prayer included construction of an elaborate set of screens to obscure the Byzantine wall paintings, which you can see here. There's this kind of like superstructure that's been sort of installed here to, with these screens to cover the wall paintings that are above. On July 28th, so just this July 28th, a few days after Haghia Sophia in Istanbul was converted back into a mosque, the Haghia Sophia in Trabzon was reopened after being closed for 2 years of restoration. So it looks nice, right? But there are still many issues from a conservation standpoint. So for example, notice that we can now see the original floor composed of pieces of colored marble, but it's not clear if the integrated lights here are LED and not overheating the stone. We also do not know if the carpet in the prayer area is fireproof and whether or not it will trap moisture. And the Byzantine wall paintings are now partially concealed by something that looks like a contemporary art installation. But this apparatus has been somehow fixed or maybe even drilled into the ancient walls. And the abundance of lights directly on the paintings is a little alarming. And then finally, the wiring that needs to go through the building for the light installation is also potentially problematic. In short, this restoration was done with little transparency, so we simply do not know how these changes were done. Only 2 weeks after Erdogan's presidential decree, Haghia Sophia was outfitted for the first Friday prayers in the building, a ceremony that officially converted the site into a mosque. And I want to stress that this is a very short amount of time to make physical changes to the building. Usually these kinds of plans take months or even years to form because you need to consult with conservationists and run impact studies to understand the potential long-term consequences of major interventions. As you can see from this photograph, the major changes to the structure for the opening prayers include laying down this green carpet on the marble floor, and then also shielding the mosaic of the Virgin Mary in the apse with these kinds of like sail-like coverings. And the concerns that I outlined for Trabzon also apply here. Is the carpet resistant fire and moisture? How are these coverings exactly attached to the walls? And are they fireproof? We just don't know. There's not been a lot of information that's been released about all of this, these changes to the site. In his presidential decree, Erdogan said, after a gap of 86 years, Haghia Sophia will serve its purpose again as laid out in the pious foundations of Mehmed the Conqueror. In this statement, the Turkish president is clearly calling for a return to the monument to its past as a symbol of Ottoman conquest. And yet, as an art historian interested in the long life of Haghia Sophia, I'm compelled to point out that Ottoman attitudes toward the Byzantine decorations in the building, most crucially the figural mosaics, changed over time. And Dr. Grenier already has sort of talked about this a little bit. For example, we know from historical accounts that the mosaic of the Virgin Mary in the apse was still visible in the building in the 18th century, which means that it was left uncovered for a long time after the initial conversion of the building by Mehmed the Conqueror in 1453. What's more, the faces of the seraphim under the central dome of Haghia Sophia were only covered up during restorations during the mid-19th century. So they were visible in the main prayer hall for a solid 4 centuries while Haghia Sophia functioned as a mosque. My research has also indicated that it was during the mid-19th century restorations that for the first time architects uncovered and documented the Byzantine mosaics before concealing them again, and this activity was all by order of the Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid. All right, so to wrap up, given the long, complex history of the building as a mosque, this all raises the question of what version of the Ottoman past is being activated in the 21st century. No matter the status or function of the building, how do we continue to advocate for a management strategy commensurate to the scale of the challenges, which includes the preservation of the historical fabric and continued visibility of the works of art of all periods, Byzantine and Ottoman, responsible management of mass tourism, and protection against the threat of earthquake. Successive Byzantine, Ottoman, and Turkish governments have protected Haghia Sophia against the ravages of time and thus maintained significance not only for themselves, but also for those to come in the future, including all of us. And so, in my opinion, it's a matter of vital concern that the current Turkish government continue this tradition of responsible stewardship. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neumeyer. Now we'll hear from Jamil Aydin.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And I would like first start by thanking the Jaffer Center and the donors of the Jaffer Center as an example of great philanthropy, and Florida International University to start this initiative and to invite us to reflect on this important event. If you're seeing me, I don't have a PowerPoint, so I will make my brief comments because my job is partly easier after the first two papers, because some of the points that I wanted to highlight is already mentioned by my esteemed colleagues. As a scholar of international history, but also global intellectual history, I want to highlight something that I found worrisome during the debates over Haghia Sophia. And what I'm worried about is the multiple narratives and myths about this event, this monument, is unfortunately provoking a revival of almost like a clash of civilization narrative between Islam and Christianity. And this is unfortunate in the sense that we are living in a post-September 11, post-Trump world. There are already a lot of people who who see every event in the Middle East as in the duality between Islam and Christianity. And this monument could also be interpreted in an opposite direction to show the alliances, the harmony, the cooperation among different religious traditions. So I want to highlight why I think there are certain myths needs to be corrected, certain legends that needs to be clarified, because that will also give us a way forward based on these interpretations. So I will focus on two important myths. And one is about the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and its Byzantine Christian background that both Emily and Carlos already mentioned. The second one is about the decision to turn this church mosque into a museum by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1934. And then I want to talk about what might happen in the future in the next 10 minutes. As Carlos and Emily already mentioned, I think the first important point to think about is that Haghia Sophia was not just a church, it was also a mosque. And I was very disturbed to see from BBC to CNN to all kinds of news agencies and reports that the Ottoman Muslim legacy of Haghia Sophia is completely overlooked and erased. And that doesn't, I mean, remembering the Ottoman mosque legacy of Haghia Sophia is important because that is, almost more than 500 years. And that is complementary to its Byzantine Christian background. Why is it important? Because as Emily mentioned, the Ottomans preserved this place and protected. And the decision to turn this church into a mosque was seen normal in the kind of civilized imperial norms of that 15th century, meaning that what they did may have looked contradictory to the Islamic legal traditions of giving protection to Christians and Jews and their religious spaces, which they did in some ways. But there was always an exception to the most significant imperial structures. And Haghia Sophia was not only an Orthodox, at some point Catholic during the Fourth Crusade, cathedral, but it was also a symbol of the Byzantine Empire. And the more we read about the details, of course, we are also more better understanding of how this process happened. We know that, just to give an example, when the Greeks became Christians, they turned Parthenon in Athens into a church. Then the Ottomans turned into a mosque, and then after the Greek independence, it just burned down. So this type of conversion of sacred spaces was very common. And in the Ottoman case, it is clear that there was something very imperial in that act, that the Ottoman Empire claimed to inherit the legacy of the Roman Empire, that Ottoman sultans used the title Caesar, as well as the title later on Caliph, Sultan, Emir, Shah, and Khan, the Mongolian tradition. And as the earlier presentations showed, the perspective on Christianity is not one of rejection. It seems that the Ottoman Muslims, while imperially turning this into a church, they believe that they are inheriting and transforming that Christian legacy. So even though many of the Turks today, Turkish citizens, think and believe that this conversion happened immediately, and immediately all the Christian Byzantine mosaics was covered, our esteemed colleagues already noted that how actually there was a long process of preservation and protections, and some of the mosaics and images remained. And other colleagues also noted how this sacralization of Haghia Sophia, Islamization happened with different legends and myths, as Prophet Hidr helping the building up of the Haghia Sophia. There's some sort of an Islamic story about that. But there are also other stories that my colleague Hayrettin Yücesoy wrote about this in a Turkish paper, that many people also knew that Prophet Muhammad himself, when he went to Kaaba, the Muslim pilgrimage center, when they were cleaning up the idols in Kaaba after conquest of Mecca, there was apparently, according to the story, a painting of Mother Mary and baby Jesus. And Prophet Muhammad told the Muslims that don't touch it and don't disturb that sign. So they kept it, according to the story, that image. So, we don't know what happened to it, because Kaaba was burned multiple times and rebuilt. And in this case, as my colleagues mentioned, that the mosaics remained. And in fact, the covering happened gradually over centuries. And the most important covering in the 19th century in Tanzimat happened after the renovation of that place. So and I think this already created the background for the decision in 1934, is that Ottoman Empire in 1840s and 50s initiated a project of restoration of Haghia Sophia. And during that restoration, they also renovated some of the paintings. And then after they renovated, they covered it in a gentle way so that we can open it later. So that, someone must have said that, we restored these places, but then as a Muslim prayer space, we shouldn't have these images. So in some ways, we can reinterpret this transition not as a conflictual and confrontational one, but as a continuation, as Carlos mentioned in the introduction. The second myth that I want to highlight is the decision to turn this into a museum in 1934. And what disturbs me as an historian of modern republic is that decision is often interpreted as a form of westernization, secularism, to impress the West and to diplomatically to develop relationship with Greece. But I want to first highlight the fact that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk had no pressure on him to turn this from a mosque to a museum. I mean, this is almost comparable to, imagine in 1934, Spanish government or Spanish king is turning the cathedral in Cordoba into a museum to kind of honor its Muslim legacy. So I disagree with the interpretation that there was pressure. I think Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who has a very complicated relationship with the Ottoman imperial past. He grew up in Thessaloniki. We can imagine that he was surrounded by, when he was growing up, with Greek friends there, in his childhood, and in Istanbul, everywhere. When you walk anywhere in 20 minutes, you will see a mosque and an Orthodox church and other religious spaces. So he is a symbol of cosmopolitanism, what we call the Ottoman cosmopolitanism. But as the founder of modern republic, of course, his life story went through a very traumatic transitions from 1912 to 1924 all the way, that during the Balkan Wars, his mother and his family had to practically walk from Selanik to Istanbul. They became refugees because Greek armies expelled the Turkish Muslim populations from there. And then he oversaw the transition of the empire to republic, with dramatically that included a period during World War I when there was Greek hope that Istanbul can also become part of the Hellenistic, at least the kind of soft Hellenistic empire. So during the British occupation of Istanbul, there were Greek flags in certain neighborhoods of Istanbul. So Atatürk is actually, in that sense, for Turks, the second savior, second conqueror of Istanbul. If Mehmet II's conquest of Istanbul gave him the right to turn a church into a mosque, he may have seen the legitimacy and the power to turn a mosque into a museum. So mosque was extremely important for even during the Republican period. In fact, some of the religious reform projects, such as reciting Quran in Turkish translation, was first experimented in Haghia Sophia. So it seems like they picked that place as very important. So what I'm trying to argue here is that Mustafa Kemal and his friends, when they make that decision to turn this into a museum, they're also giving a new opening, a new beginning, a new relationship with the imperial past, also with the multiple past of modern republic. That includes both Islam and Christianity. They are not doing this because they are anti-Muslim, secular in their mind. And this is an important point to highlight in the sense that the decision now to turn the museum back into a mosque has nothing to do with Christianity, has nothing to do with Greeks. It's all about Turkish nationalism and different competing ideological versions of Turkish nationalism. Since the 1950s, the ideological conservative, still nationalist groups who oppose the legacy of Kemalist secularism highlighted this conversion of a mosque into a museum to somehow shame the earlier Republican regime. And their argument is that why did you do this? Given the fact that Mehmet II is our hero. And Turkish nationalism, of course, glorifies as this Ottoman background, even though initially they were depicting Ottomans as this kind of decadent, collapsing imperial past. But they always highlighted the greatness of Mehmet II who conquered the city. So it was Turkified, even though we can think that Mehmet II is an emperor first, and he didn't build a Turkish nationalist state in 1500, but the Turkish nationalism depicted him as a nationalist hero. So this oppositional discourse of shaming Kemalism for betraying the legacy of Mehmet II and turning a mosque into a museum, then have been picked up by groups, nationalist groups who are conservative nationalists that then produce the party in power today, to go and do protests. So what they will do is that in the 60s and 70s, they will all buy a ticket and go to the Haghia Sophia and try to pray in the garden of Haghia Sophia. And that's this current decision actually comes from this internal Turkish conflict. Therefore, if you ever paid attention to the first sermon in the mosque when it's opened, there was no critique of Byzantines or Christians or Greeks. In fact, a lot of people perceived a harsh critique of the founding father Mustafa Kemal and his decision. To wrap up, I think we see how in internal Turkish nationalist ideological conflict then ends up being globalized and internationalized as if it is a clash between Islam and Christianity, although domestically this is not the main question. Finally, for the next 1 or 2 minutes, I would like to highlight that this is not the end of the story yet. And there is a misconception and misperception that with this decision to turn into this space into a mosque, Christians are not going to be able to see and visit. The heritage will be destroyed. That is not necessarily true. So they have to do all kind of acrobatics in terms of covering of the mosaics with curtains while Muslims are praying. But the preservation commitment is already there, and there won't be any destructions or damage. In fact, now the tourists could visit free of charge. It was, relatively expensive ticket to go in there because it's very popular. So I don't know how this is going to be managed, but the space will be open, except the prayer times, which only takes 30, 40 minutes in a single day. And other times, like people visit Haghia Sophia, they could be able, Blue Mosque, they could be able to visit Haghia Sophia as well. There could only be some sort of restrictions on a woman's clothing, like headscarf and things like that when you enter the space. That also means that we should think about the future in some ways of reinterpreting that space that is more respectful of both its Christian Byzantine as well as its Muslim legacy, and to resist the narratives of clash of civilizations and clash between religions. And I will leave it here with my own comments on how we can go rescue this story from the myths and ideological narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aydin. Now we'll hear from Muhammad Humayun Vash. Thank you.
Thank you. I would also like to thank the Jaffer Center at FIU and Carlos Yu, and also Emily and Jamil for quite insightful remarks. So what I would like to do, maybe to build up on the previous speakers, is to widen the aperture a little bit and look at the issue from a regional and international perspective. In terms of official state reaction, based on what I was able to gather, I think only a handful of countries were actually came out publicly, either in support of what happened or adopted an officially neutral position. And I can cite Russia, Iran, Oman, and China among them, and to a lesser degree, Morocco. These were either neutral or in favor of the decision to convert Haghia Sophia into a mosque. But I think in terms of unofficial, informal public opinion in the Sunni Muslim world, I think the majority of the Sunni Muslim world was actually in favor of this decision. Because, you know, the Sunni Muslim world, Muslim world in general, we see these cross currents of nationalism, Islamism, you know, anti-Zionism and anti-Westernism. But these cross currents sometimes blur across domestic and regional and now international and, you know, global levels in quite complicated and sometimes contradictory, but oftentimes consequential ways. And these, you know, affect the attitude and, you know, opinion, both in the so-called, you know, Arab street or Muslim street, if you will, and also among the ruling elites. But let's not forget that triumphalism still has a lot of traction and a lot of, you know, resonance in the Muslim world. The Muslim world, you know, feels, and it's been feeling, a general, you know, sense of humiliation, being victimized, you know, taken advantage of, and almost helplessness. And I think President Erdogan has quite shrewdly captured those sentiments and put himself out there as probably the only Sunni Muslim statesman that publicly, assertively, you know, unabashedly, although some people might say largely rhetorically, stand up, you know, to the West. And this attitude and this posture, without a question, has certain appeal in the Muslim world writ large. So when I look at the reaction, for example, of some, you know, Gulf Cooperation Council countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, even those countries were a little bit more skittish than you might have otherwise thought in objecting to the conversion of Haghia Sophia, knowing, I think, full well how their populace, you know, thought about this conversion. But also, you know, again, building up on what Jamil said, discussing the conversion, I think we should not lose sight of the fact that we've had a process of conversion of mosques into non-Islamic places of worship. And these have happened, you know, for a very long time, for centuries, you know, from Greece, obviously, to, you know, to the Balkans, you know, we don't forget, you know, what happened in Serbia. Also, you know, to India, and I guess, you know, most prominently Spain after the, you know, and during the so-called Reconquista, you know, beginning in the 14th, 15th centuries onwards. But I think the fundamental question, maybe for our audience and our scholars here and our students, is what is really driving and energizing President Erdogan's decision and this generic posture that we see from Turkey? Is it a domestic play? Is it a regional play? Or is it, you know, international and global? And who is, you know, the audience for this, you know, some people call neo-Ottomanist posture? Obviously, critics, accuse President Erdogan of self-aggrandizement, of adopting this, this self-righteous tactical, ploy, if you will, trying to revolutionize Turkey in his own image. But I think that's not entirely convincing and maybe a little bit simplistic. So what I thought I could do to explain this a little bit more systematically and with more structure was to look at this issue from domestic, regional, and international perspectives. I think domestically in Turkey, like anywhere else pretty much in the world, we see a rising tide of identity politics. And I think the AK Party, the Justice and Development Party, has been a beneficiary and also a crafty, smart user of that generic trend that we see globally in trying to gradually, incrementally deconstruct the Kemalist legacy of Atatürk. Sometimes more implicitly, but sometimes, more explicitly, maybe in this case of the conversion of Haghia Sophia. But I think we should also, looking at that, at that legacy of AK Party trying to deconstruct that legacy, we should not forget the fact that the Ottoman Empire was a largely multicultural, decentralized, multi-faith, multi-ethnic, millet system, as they used to have. So this was not a puritanical, rejectionist, caliphate, as sometimes is portrayed, in the West through revisionist historiography of the Ottoman Empire. So I think for a good chunk, for a sizable, swath of Turkish society, the conversion of Haghia Sophia, is a way to address the traumatic events at the onset of the Turkish Republic, in the 20th century, in the 1920s, and reforms that were taken by, by the founder of the modern Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. People in the West sometimes forget that the backdrop of the issue at hand is this long-running legal battle over the status of various, what is in Arabic called, in Islam called awqaf, which is the plural of waqf. And waqf is essentially an inalienable, I should say, perpetual charitable endowment in Islam. And Haghia Sophia belonged to that category of endowments. And I think, we should look at the issue against that, that backdrop. So, so for a lot of, these more, traditionalist, maybe leaning folks in Turkish society and also elsewhere in the Muslim world, this battle to restore Haghia Sophia as a mosque symbolizes for them the socioculturally and politically, turned people of Turkey, the fact that this militant, Kemalist reforms was essentially, maybe an amputation of the Islamic identity of, of tens of millions of people and their national dignity. Some folks have gone even further, have called, what happened in that era, internal colonization of Turkey. So I don't want to go that far, but I'm just saying that this is, the opinion that we have to recognize looking at this issue in the West. So, so that bleaching of Turkey's Ottoman history by Ataturk, I think was bound to backfire and to fail. And it sure did when the, Justice and Development Party swept to power in Turkey in the 2000s. So, but also I think in this, domestic perspective, we should also not lose sight of the fact that, that under AK Party, we have seen the reversal of state seizure of endowments that belong to, for example, Christians and Jews. So you have now churches and synagogues that have been refurbished and are being used by these minority communities, in Turkey. So we have to, I think, be a little bit more balanced and well-rounded in, in analyzing this issue. But regionally, I think in Turkish foreign policy, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union after Cold War, you have three big impulses. You have a Kemalist impulse, which is the status quo impulse. Now it's it's in decline and it's been in retreat. But you have two revisionist impulses. One is the Islamist impulse, and I think the third one, which is talked much less about, is a pan-Turkic nationalist impulse. And these two, Islamist and pan-Turkic, are more of revisionist impulses. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, I think you had a generic sense that Turkey's strategic weight in the international system plummeted because the Soviet Union was not around, and Turkey, although being part of NATO, it gave Turkey certain caliber and weight, but in general, Turkey felt, I think, domestically, especially the foreign policy establishment, that Turkey did not occupy the same strategic weight as it did during the Cold War. So with that plummeting of international weight, I think Turkey decided, and this is not something that started just recently, this has been going on for the past 2.5, 3 decades. Turkey decided to reactivate its foreign policy and to re-engage the Middle East a little bit more intimately and more assertively. And I think for part of the blame, at least, for why Turkey decided to kind of turn its back a little bit on Europe, not entirely, but a little bit, and face and maybe a little bit embrace, especially since the 2010s, the Middle East. Part of that blame should go to Europe, because remember, Turkey has been led around by the West, by the Europeans, in terms of its membership in the EU for decades upon decades right now. So we should not forget that fact. But also, what is emerging more recently, I think, is that this activist, regionalist foreign policy play for Turkey is a dicey, I think, enterprise, because it runs the risk of triggering a counterbalancing and rollback response from Turkey's vicinity. And I think right now we see that response in the Eastern Mediterranean, where you have an emerging Greece, Cyprus, plus Egypt, Israel axis that seem to be trying to outflank Turkey. So that is my regional level analysis of trying to contextualize what's going on with this conversion. Also internationally, I think internationally as well, Turkey, like maybe some other countries in Europe as well, has been developing, EU skepticism, also some level of NATO skepticism. And this, this is also, partly a function of the fact that countries are not sure about the future of US involvement, in Europe, in the Middle East, and Turkey, as we know, straddles both those regions. And that, that's feeling of uncertainty, I think, reinforces these EU plus NATO trends of skepticism in Turkey. Turkey in general, internationally, I think tries to view itself as a Eurasian country, maybe in order to regain its international status and caliber somewhat, but geopolitically, there is really no Eurasia as a distinct reality. I think Turkey in reality is, is a country, maybe an insulator state that straddles the Middle East and Europe. Obviously now, Turkey is far more engaged strategically in the Middle East than it is in Europe. But Turkey, I think, if it could manage to kind of knit the security dynamics of the Middle East and Europe, then it could create this Eurasian reality in which Turkey will become a central player. But I think we're far away from that, that point right now. So traditionally, international relations, these types of countries that straddle two regions with conflictual relationships are expected to act with some level of passivity in their foreign policy because they want to absorb the energy of these separate regions that they straddle. And as a matter of fact, the Kemalist foreign policy of Turkey had all signs of that passivity. For example, the key foreign policy doctrine of Kemalism was peace at home and peace abroad, and that signals that that passive foreign policy. But I think again, internationally, Turkey under Erdogan wants to have a strong and active role with ambitions of playing acting as a regional great power or even superpower. But it's, again, it's like I said, it's a very dicey enterprise because this is a very complex region with different dynamics. We're talking about the EU, we're talking about the CIS countries, we're talking about, Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf. And Turkey has some level of presence in all those regions. And trying to devise a cohesive foreign policy that has relevance in across all those regions is not going to be easy. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Humayun Vash. So we have about 20 minutes for question and answer and discussion, maybe a little less than 20 minutes. So to open things off, I'd like to just offer one question before we turn to questions from the audience. This is for Dr. Neumeyer. I am sort of interested in the moment in the 19th century when that last bit of mosaic decoration in the church was covered during the course of a comprehensive renovation process. I was wondering if you, by any chance, might know about a similar debate happening at the time to what we're facing now, because in a way it's sort of a parallel. Both of them were kind of trying to forge this structure into an ideal image of what a mosque should be in the face of certain oppositions. So I was wondering if you had any comments or any knowledge about that moment in the 19th century when the mosque was whitewashed for its final time.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Dr. Grenier. I want to stress that a lot of what I'm about to say is kind of like, things I've read in secondary sources, but, maybe kind of like apocryphal stories that may or may not be true. Yeah, I mean, in my reading about the 19th century restoration, so in the mid-19th century, Haghia Sophia was frankly falling apart and badly need of repair, and the Sultan Abdülmecid ordered a massive restoration of the building, like top, ceiling to floor. And there are as I sort of read about it, there are interesting moments where there are sort of suggestions that there's not necessarily, like, there are some kind of debates, or there's some kind of not necessarily like a consensus, among the courtiers in the Ottoman government about what should be done exactly with the building. So as I mentioned, we do know that the Sultan's architects did uncover the Byzantine mosaics and document them. And there's also a story that it's clear that the Sultan was very fond of Byzantine mosaics. Like, he had that monogram like made up for him in the style of Byzantine mosaic to like commemorate the restoration. And there's also a story that he wanted to insert a mosaic, like of his own figure in that mosaic of Justinian and Constantine, like offering up the Haghia Sophia, like to the Virgin Mary. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but we do have that mosaic. But anyway, there is a story that the Sultan wanted to leave the mosaics uncovered, but like he knew this would not be acceptable among the clerics, the Muslim clerics, like in the court. So there's also a story that he waited to do the restoration until like the clerics took a trip on Hajj or something, like, so they were like out of the city. I also don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, So there was, look, what we do know is that they did uncover the mosaics, they did document them, and then they were covered back up for whatever reason. We also know that there are these sort of elements where the Sultan's clearly fond of or interested in the mosaics. So, even just that data, those facts, indicate that there was some kind of, discussion or debate about how do we deal with this building as a mosque, but also as a monument. That's what's really interesting. I think that's what's really important about the mid-19th century moment, is that it's clear that the Ottomans were also thinking like, this is a monument now, not just a mosque, but it can be both. And how do we deal with it?
Yeah, thank you. That answers my questions. I was very curious about that moment. Okay, so we have a few questions from the audience, and I hope we'll have time to address them all. The first one is from Mohammed Al-Mutayiri. The question, which perhaps should be addressed to Dr. Aydin, is, do you believe that the recent conversion of Haghia Sophia into a mosque is an indication of Erdogan's neo-Ottomanist policy to revive traditional Islamic values through the functionality of the state of Turkey? So perhaps you can give a nuanced answer to this very complicated question.
Thank you. This will also give me a chance to reiterate one of my points, perhaps in conversation with Mohammed. I do think that this event did not receive much support from the so-called Islamic world, Muslim world, because this idea of a Muslim internationalism is highly defensive. Muslim internationalism is based on the legacy of European colonialism and injustices. It's very anti-colonial. Muslim internationalism happened when Bosnian Muslims are subject to genocide, or Trump's racism. This is actually very confusing to people. Like, this is already under Turkish sovereignty. It's a Muslim hero. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk did this, right? He's a humanist Muslim, and that sort of misinterpretation of Atatürk's decision as a sellout Muslim was betraying Islamic tradition is extremely wrong. I mean, this man saved Turkey from Greek invasion. If you look from that Turkish Kemalist nationalist perspective, he is the hero that saved Muslims from an Hellenistic imperial occupation, and probably the potential conversion of that place. So that I think is the response from the Muslim world was very, very minimal, much below what Turkish government expected. In terms of neo-Ottomanism and the ideological debate, I mean, that's exactly my point, is that this is not an Islamic opinion versus a secular opinion. There are different Muslim humanism and different Muslim interpretations of Haghia Sophia. So people who wanted to keep Haghia Sophia as a museum are equally Muslim. They are no less or more Muslim than others. But their interpretation somehow lost because of that decision. And decision is, Mohammed mentioned, it's a legal decision, but it's a very tricky one. I mean, if you open that box that any foundation 500 years ago are still valid, then anyone can go to a court, claim that they have a relationship to a foundation in the past. I mean, you can't really do that. There is a kind of a radical transformation of a transition from Ottoman Empire to modern Turkey, where at some point, all the foundations were confiscated and given to a state bank. And just one note is also highly contradictory, that this is the foundation that Mehmet II established for the Haghia Sophia. But Mehmet II himself was not very respectful of the Islamic law with regard to the foundation. He confiscated, almost imperialized about 1,000 foundations because he was worried that he couldn't tax them. He wanted to channel their money to the building up of Istanbul. So in his own time, he was the much disliked sultan. Actually, people liked his son more because he was, he wanted to build Istanbul as a great city. That's why he was trying to channel all the Waqf resources. So his son actually then returned all the lands of the foundations back to the owners. But in terms of neo-Ottomanism, I will say that definitely domestic desire is there, but it seems everybody is almost overcome by their own ideological narratives. And that's why we see all these contradictory moves where the first sermon talks about Islamophobia and Muslim-Christian harmony, while the imam was carrying a sword based on a tradition that I didn't even know existed. I will leave it here.
Thank you. Mohammed Humayun Vash, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this question as well, or on any of the points that Dr. Aydin raised. You're muted still. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I think this Waqf question actually should be taken more seriously than maybe Professor Aydin, would like it to. Because remember, this Waqf is a foundational pillar of building a lot of these charitable humanitarian organizations throughout Islamic history. So we can't really be dismissive or discounting towards this issue. They've been the foundation for building hospitals, a lot of schools, the Nizamiya school, for example, that Haghia Nizam al-Mulk, the Persian prime minister, built. He was prime minister, but he built that, chain of schools from Baghdad to Nishabur and elsewhere, not in his official capacity, but prime minister, but also as an individual. And I think this is, what we need maybe to understand, to separate, Sultan Muhammad II, the Sultan, from the individual. And then maybe this Waqf, tradition, which goes all the way back to the Prophet's time, actually. This is not something new. And its, key status in Islamic civilization, maybe we can take it a little bit more seriously.
Just one quick note before the next question. I mean, I do agree the Waqfs are important, but you could have interpreted Waqf income, which actually lost. There's no income, so it will be financed by Turkish government now. All the things, in a way that allowed keeping it as a museum, but at the same time, I just need to remind everyone that there was actually a call for prayers and a possibility to pray next to the museum. So Turkish government already allocated a small space for praying. And there was an imam. So there was some sort of a hybrid structure that could have been kept. There was no reason to then convert the whole monument, because this is, by the way, next to the big mosque, Blue Mosque, which is done partly in imitation, but also in competition with the other one. So there is no actual demand for a prayer space. I mean, you're basically 2 minutes walk from the great mosque, which is not, as Erdogan himself said, which is not even full during a Friday prayer.
Thank you. So we have very many questions and probably not enough time to go through them all. So I'm going to try to go roughly in order. Here's a question for Dr. Neumeyer from Mehmet Ulutaş. Can Dr. Neumeyer elaborate upon what architect Mimar Sinan did in the 16th century to reinforce the structure of Haghia Sophia?
Sure, I can do that pretty quickly. Mimar Sinan, who was, I'd say is the most famous architect from the Ottoman Empire. He was the court architect under 3 sultans, primarily under Süleyman I. And he essentially, under his tenure, Haghia Sophia was also in a bad state of repair. I wonder if you're noticing a theme here, right? It's an old building. It needs constant repair. I mean, that's the thing, right? It's constantly needs attention. And I think there was like some buckling or something of the walls, and they were really, I mean, this is an just in case if some of y'all don't know, I mean, this is a highly earthquake prone zone. So earthquakes are a real issue. And I mean, the dome at that point had fallen down multiple times. So it fell down a few decades after its first construction. And then one half fell down in 1000 and the other half fell down in the 14th century. And this was just during the Byzantine period, okay? So in the 16th century, there was some concerns of structural, the structure was being compromised, and Mimar Sinan essentially built buttressing on all 4 sides of the building to basically reinforce, the sort of amazing structural tension, the tensile forces that the dome is bearing down on all the walls, which is definitely a potential issue. So he essentially put in all this buttressing that essentially and you know what, the dome's still there, so.
Thank you. So now I'm going to fuse a couple questions from 2 different audience members. and ask about the possibility that I know that these discussions were happening earlier on in the process of having the building also worship for, also open to some sort of Christian prayer as well. I know that the Patriarchate, the Greek Patriarchate had voted this issue. I was wondering if any of you knew anything about that and whether there's still any possibility for that.
I mean, I think that is one option in the sense that the hope of the kind of broader Greek Orthodox Christian community, because they don't have, from their perspective, they don't have enough community members to sustain a church. So even if someone says, "Oh, take it back, this could be your church," they can finance it. They can. There's nobody who can pray there. The size of the Orthodox Christian community is very minimum now. Many of them left due to various reasons. Mostly by force, sometimes after World War I. So there was an idea of a symbolic opening of that space. I think this seems to be the last option if you don't want to have a museum. But given the current symbolic significance of this for the kind of one version of Turkish nationalism, I don't see much hope for it. That will be a very difficult thing. I mean, it's not even at the table at this point. Something to evaluate from the perspective of Turkish government.
Thank you. We've got time for maybe 2 or 3 more, so I'll start with one from Naisi Sardoui. Can anyone comment on the Muslim theological discussions on the appropriateness of having converted the cathedral to a mosque then and now? To offer my own perspective.
Can respond to that?
Yes, I mean, insofar as I've been able to sort of track the history of this discussion, the legal theorists have essentially said that since it was conquered, the Arabic word onwatan, with power, it can be transformed into whatever it wants to be. However, some of you might be aware that in certain conversations that are happening throughout the Islamic world, in opposition to this handover, that the idea has been floated that, well, if we turn Haghia Sophia into a mosque, then what's to prevent Israel from turning the Temple Mount into a temple again, even though it houses Muslim holy sites? So I know that this kind of theological historical debate is currently happening. That's what I can offer to answer that question. So I think we'll move on to one last question from Abdulkader Enes Özer. Until last year, Erdogan and his party have been opposed to the idea of turning Haghia Sophia into a mosque. Not only had he stated this many times in public, he highly criticized the idea because he thought it would have harsh consequences on the international scale. Now that Turkey is facing severe problems inside the country, especially economically, can we say that turning Haghia Sophia into a mosque was a political strategy to change the agenda of the country and recover votes of the AKP?
Maybe I briefly comment on this. Yes, there could be such an intention behind it, but I will say that the legal plea came almost 15 years ago. So the process started 15 years ago. You can say that maybe the courts decided in that political context with some sort of encouragement. But the observation in general is that it didn't bring too much support. I mean, people are busy with other things. So even if they symbolically very important in Anatolia, this kind of conservative romantic nationalism that Erdogan is a hero to turn this unfair act of, unfair and undemocratic act of turning Haghia Sophia into a museum, he rectified it. But just to note that in this broader context, there is some debate on the legacy of Mustafa Kemal himself and the early republic. So just to remember that Mustafa Kemal kept Greek Patriarchate in Istanbul, but the Turkish parliament abolished the caliphate. And certain decisions done from 1924 to 1945 is still a scene of battle of competing ideological programs in Turkey. And Haghia Sophia is more about that, this decision. People are still acting out that one. That's why I say that this is more of an internal domestic Turkish nationalist issue rather than an international one, but then the mismeaning completely internationalized. And I hope, in terms of the previous question, I hope that someone reciprocated this act in 1934 of turning into a museum of protecting by saying that, oh, we are also trying to restore some of your mosques in the Balkans, I think Mohammed mentioned, or, you can also pray in Cordoba. If that had happened, because this act remained unreciprocated, people also say, you did this nice humanist gesture, and who cares? You're still the evil Muslim, barbaric. And then, this event then confirmed that theory. So I also you need to think about the unfairness of the broader context of the narratives that Muslims are expected to do certain things that Christians are not supposed to do that. Nobody expects from the Greek government to turn anything into a mosque again, although after Greek independence, in the so-called Decolonial Nationals Act, many of the mosques were destroyed. And that has a different reflections on India, of course, with the Babri Mosque, which then Indian Supreme Court now recognizes a Hindu temple, and then they will build a temple, and then they will never rebuild the mosque there again.
Thank you.
Can I interject very quickly, Carlos?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, on that theological question, which I think is an extremely important question, maybe you should talk a little bit about that. I think in general, based on my understanding and my reading of Islamic history, going all the way back to the city of Medina, which was the first, seat of government in Islam under the Prophet himself, this was, a place where, Abrahamic religions at least lived side by side. So there was this element of coexistence, and then, if you look at the fourth caliph and first Imam Ali in Kufa, maybe the second capital of, of Islam. Also there is a cited hadith that, that someone was pushing Imam Ali at the time was, head of state to convert I think it was a church into a mosque, and he actually rebuffed the idea and resisted it. So this puritanical rejectionist stream that we see, unfortunately, in some, Islamic, jurisprudential, readings right now is actually a relatively new modern phenomena and is not organic to traditional Islam when we read, the history of Islam's, expansion in the first few centuries. So I just wanted to make sure that, we don't fall into this trap of, presentism to read Islam's history through the prism of what's going on and the relationship between Islam and other Abrahamic religions right now.
Thank you for that important point. And I'll also add, in that same vein, that when the third Caliph Omar conquered Jerusalem, he did not transform the Church of the Holy Sepulchre into a mosque. It remained a church and remains a church to this day. So the precedents for this transformation have to be historically situated and can't be projected across the entirety of Islamic history. So with that, I think we have to bring this panel to a close. We've stretched a little over time, but I'd like to thank each of the panelists for their very insightful contributions. I really think this has proved to be a very interesting discussion to an event that is still ongoing and in a way still developing. And I would also like to thank all of the members of the audience, all of our students, all of our community members who have showed up today. And I hope that this has been interesting and educational for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.